Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Eli Klein. I'm the Artistic Associate Music here at the Harbourfront Centre. Thank you for joining us for SoundClash Festival. Let's have more clapping. SoundClash Festival. Woo! We are very excited to be hosting this next panel on the history of the Toronto Rave Movement. We have a top-notch panel of experts spanning the history of the movement over the last 20 plus years. But first of all, let me tell you a little something about Harbourfront Centre, that everything we do here, 95% of our programming is free. And it's free because of support by people like you, and there are ways you can support us back. Inside the info booth, you can make a cash donation. You can also make donations to our volunteers who are at the WestJet stage. They are wearing yellow aprons and are carrying around boxes. You can also text FREE, F-R-E-E, to 30333, which will put $5 on your phone bill and give us $5, and we will be much appreciated. We are also very grateful for our government supporters, corporate sponsors, and media partners that are noted in your What's On brochure. And just a little bit about the SoundClash Festival in general. This is our second year running and our third year for the awards. I do encourage you to check out the awards show that's on the Red Path stage. Brendan Phillips about to go up, but later tonight we also have Grounders, The Thing Is, and Jessica Stewart Few. But at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Denise Benson, our host for the next 2 hours here in the Boulevard tent. She'll tell you a little bit about the panelists, but thank you for joining us here at Harbourfront Centre.
Thank you, Eli. Hey, guys. Thanks for coming out this gorgeous, gorgeous afternoon. My name is Denise Benson. I'm currently a writer for The Grid, and I write a series called Then and Now, which is about the history of Toronto club culture. I've been involved in the scene for about 20-something years as a DJ, and definitely harken back to the early rave days as somebody who played occasionally and went out to them a whole lot more. Basically, when Harbourfront approached me with the idea of doing panels about electronic music culture in this city, it was kind of a wide open, we could talk about any number of things. And I suggested the idea of talking about Toronto rave culture, the Toronto Rave Movement, specifically because we're now a couple of decades past and there is an incredible history to reflect on with how amazingly huge the rave movement was here in Toronto, and also just the legacy that it's left, the things that go on in this city to this day that very much connect to what went down decades ago. So the legacy panel, talking about what is happening currently in the city, will happen from 6 to 7 p.m., so I hope a lot of you will return for that one. But in the meantime, because the impact's been felt to this day and because our rave movement was impressive, I mean, when we look back, there were a number of years where pretty much every weekend in town, we had parties of 5,000 to 10,000 people and multiple parties like that. So obviously it touched on many, many lives. And as we can see, lots of people who were involved in the movement now have children, now have families, and have come out with their kids too, which is awesome, including some of our panelists. I want to introduce you to our panel. We have a number of folks joining us today, including Alex Dordovic, better known to the world as Alex D. He is the editor and publisher of Tribe magazine, and of course, Tribe was a national print free magazine that was published 93 through 2005, and there were 105 issues published over time. Of course, the Tribe message boards were and are massively, massively popular and influential, and just a place that people got their information and got connected. First up, give a welcome to Mr. Alex D. of Tribe. Thank you, Alex. Also on board today, Mr. Ryan Kruger, who once upon a time was DJ OS2. He is now the managing director of Electronic Nation Canada, which is the dance music division of Live Nation Canada. Think Digital Dreams and a whole lot more. Before joining Live Nation, he founded and ran Destiny Events, which I'm sure is a familiar name to many of you here. It was and is one of North America's longest-running indie electronic event producers. And, of course, they produced hundreds and hundreds of events and also, of course, produced the WEMF, World Electronic Music Festival, which was and is, again, very, very influential. Give it up for Mr. Ryan Kruger. This feels like a bit of a reunion for us as we all gathered, so I'm sure it is for some of you as well. Mr. Mark Oliver, who is occasionally known by his rave alias of Shuggy. I don't know, that might be a little known fact. Mark, am I giving anything away? massively influential on the Canadian music scene for many, many reasons. Most know him as a DJ who has been at the Guvernment from its inception, but Mark goes back to many, many other parties. Of course, the infamous Acid Jazz Wednesdays at the Cameron, playing at clubs like Tasmanian Ballroom, Still Life, Go-Go. And when we talk about the early, early rave days in this city, we have to talk about 23 Hop, and I'm sure we will today. Mark Oliver, one of the key resident DJs from 23 Hop. Give it up for Mr. Mark Oliver. And in the green shirt, we have Steve Mealing, a.k.a. Stretch of StretchandHooker, known as a DJ and also one of the co-founders of LifeForce Industries. They produced a whole pile of raves and parties under a bunch of sub-names, including, of course, Dose, Connected, and the whole Freakin' series. Dose Clothing as well, and he was one of the partners in Turbo Nightclub. He has already made his way up here, but let's give it up for Mr. Steve Mealing, a.k.a. Stretch. So, I've given people a sense of an overview of each of your backgrounds, but each of you, to my knowledge, came to the rave scene in Toronto for different reasons, at different times, and in different ways. So, just to give people a sense of who you are and what your connection is, let's talk a little bit about how you got connected to the rave scene and in what way you were involved. Alex, you go back to before we had something we called a rave scene. Do you want to talk a little bit about your history?
I started a magazine to cover DJ culture in Toronto. There wasn't really anything on like that at the time. It was mostly like the publication you worked for, and Now magazine, that covered live bands at the time. And I thought, there was a huge scene of DJs playing in the city, and it needed to be covered. And so I started a magazine, gave up my real job, and started this grassroots kind of magazine to cover it. And as that grew, and the rave scene grew parallel to it, I just followed it through the end, I guess. And I'm still doing it online, yeah.
One thing I want to ask before we pass on over to Ryan is, could you talk just a touch about the kind of movement from our underground warehouse scene, very much about house music, and then the flip to raves, because obviously there's a direct link there.
Oh, it was interesting because in the early 90s, Toronto had this huge, a bunch of buildings that are now condos, basically in the club district. There were abandoned buildings or empty warehouse buildings. And every Saturday night, there were 2 or 3 huge parties going on there. People listening to house music, DJs playing in the dark, with like no lights, and totally illegal, but fantastic. And this had been going on for a few years under the radar, and at the same time the rave scene was being born, and there wasn't much crossover except for Mark here, who actually played in both types of things at the time. He could probably get more into that, but there was a separation between the two types of people who went to these things. But in the end, the rave scene took over and grew out, just exploded, and the warehouse party scene sort of diminished.
And I just want to give props to Tribe for covering both and a whole lot more. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, turning over to you, Ryan. How did you get involved in the rave scene? What drew you to it in the first place?
I was, I remember this. I actually remember the actual song that got me into the rave scene, because I grew up, high school for me was late 80s. I was into Depeche Mode, New Order, all that kind of stuff, which was sort of the precursor to sort of the modern electronic music. And there really was no raves, in 89, 90 when I sort of started going to nightclubs and stuff like that. And I remember hearing a song called Test 4, and it was like, doot, 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 doot. And that was it. Like, it was just the most basic electronic song you've ever heard in your life. Mark will remember it, I think, no. But it was literally that song, and I heard it at Go-Go, which used to be a nightclub that changed into Joe, and I think is now City TV. Anyway, I heard this song, and then it got me talking to the DJ about what it was and what it is, and he's like, oh, you're gonna love this one, and I think he put Injected with a Poison on, or The Spice Must Flow, or some other really classic track, and he goes, take this flyer, you're gonna love it. And it was for Mark Oliver's party at 23 Hop next door. So if it had not been for that one song and for Mark Oliver, and I think the year was probably 1991, if I'm not mistaken, I would have never actually gotten into this scene, but it just happened to be the right place, the right time. Walked in the door, it was a life-changing experience for me. It really changed my perspective on going out, having a good time, what good music was, and all those kind of things. And from that point forward, I think I went to a couple of raves in '91, and by the end of 1991, I was literally on the street handing out flyers for somebody. And within 6 months from there, I was throwing my own parties. So it was a very quick ascension into the promoter world. I've been told I'm the longest running rave promoter in North America. I'm not 100% sure that's true, but either that makes me really old or really experienced.
Or really broke.
There was definitely some lean times, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about those. Anyway, enough about me. Mark, take it over.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I was introduced to the rave scene. Well, there was no rave scene here when I got into the music. So I'd been in Scotland, where I'm originally from, in the late 80s, mid to late 80s. And house music there was just sort of bubbling under the surface. You would hear it in some clubs, but the rave scene hadn't exploded yet. 1988 was the summer of love over in the UK, and that's when the rave scene really exploded. And I was getting all the records sent over here from friends and trying to create a rave scene here. And I thought, well, it's so massive over there, there's no reason why it can't take off here. The first rave I threw was 1988, November in 1988 at the Tasmanian Ballroom. And I think the first night, maybe 5 people showed up. And it was basically people who had been in UK for the summer, and they'd been raving all summer, and they came back here the end of the summer. They saw the ad. I have it here. I'll show you later. So they showed up, and that was it. 5 people. So I threw one the following week, and about 12 people showed up. And it was the same 5 with a couple of friends, and then about 6 undercover cops. And I'll show you why, because the ad, this was in Now magazine. That was the ad for the first rave. So they obviously had been warned, through a fax from Interpol or something, of the evils of ecstasy and rave culture. And so yeah, that was it. And obviously it couldn't survive. I had the music, all the other elements were missing. Especially a great crowd. You always need a crowd for a party. So I thought, by the time it happens here in Toronto, I'll probably have moved on to something else. And at the time I was playing acid jazz nights as well at the same time. So it was probably 3 years later that the rave scene here actually took off. And I was working at HMV on Yonge Street. Some guys came in and they're like, hey, can you get me on the guest list for that club you're playing at, which was 23 Hop. So I put these guys on a guest list, and they brought about 20 people, and that was it. That was the first core rave crowd, and they were from Brampton, although they said they were a football team traveling from England, I think, and they all had fake accents and stuff. So anyway, from that, it exploded. The next week, there was 50 people, and the following week, 100. 23 Hops shut down, and there was nowhere for everyone to go. For the ravers, there were tons of warehouse parties at the time. But, with all the elements of rave that we know are associated with rave, there wasn't anything. So John Angus, Anthony Donnelly approached me, and they said, listen, can we rent 23 Hop? Do you know the owner? I was like, yeah, we can do that. So we put up the money. We rented the space. We didn't call it 23 Hop. We called it 318 Richmond. And we started Exodus, which was the first rave company in Toronto. And then things, caught like wildfire. Attendance doubled, tripled every week by, within 3 months we were up to maybe 1,000 people, and then 2,000, and then these guys here all took over, and I sort of just focused on the DJ side of things because I was a horrible promoter. So Wayne, it's up to you now.
Actually, I don't think you're a horrible promoter. I think you're a fantastic promoter, and we're all pretty grateful for that. My story is less colorful. I ended up listening to electronic music and tactile music through, funny enough, my use of LSD, trying to trip each other out. My friends and I would seek out the trippiest music. Next thing you know, I fell further into the rabbit hole. It's 1993, and I've got about $20,000 I borrowed on the line trying to throw an event up north in Barrie. Being the only sober person there, I could do the math to figure out it wasn't going to work out again. So the next event we ended up doing down in Toronto, and that went along with our clothing line at the time, which was called Dose.
And you were the official supplier of clothing for all the Destiny parties.
Copy of that. And funny enough, we ended up in the scene through a group of hippies actually up north that have been traveling through the state, known as Deadheads, that have been touring and following. And kind of things just blossomed from there, and that's where we met all these great people along the way.
Now, it's interesting, as Mark mentioned, of course, Exodus being the first rave company, and there's so much more rave history than we could ever touch on in the hour or so that we have together today. But, you know, one of the contentious things, there's lots of people, as we were discussing earlier, there's lots of people who are like, I was there first, or I was there, or I wasn't, you know. There's that kind of stuff that when you try and trace back a history that was a bit nebulous or a bit wavy, or, you know, lots
Blurry.
of blurred lines and so on. But, you know, there are lots of early parties that happened. But when we go back, I just want to make mention when thinking about 318 and AKA 23 Hop, people like Malik X, people like Dr. No, people like Alex of London. There's lots of, you know, number of people who deserve to get props. And I'd just like to turn to you, Mark, and ask you, and then all of us sort of touch on a little bit about, quickly off the top of our heads, people that we'd like to give a shout out to.
Yeah, of course, Malik X and Dr. No. Actually, Dr. No's a little known fact. His real name is Neil, but so we were all hanging out at the Cameron House. Malik was the DJ at the time on Wednesday nights before I took over the Acid Jazz Night. And it was all rare groove. It was a great Wednesday night where everyone promoted the parties for the weekend. So we decided, you know, we were going to put together a team of DJs for the first rave for Exodus. And it was Malik X, who was playing a lot of hardcore at the time, which then became known as Jungle. And his friend Neil, who was Dr. No on his radio show on CKLN. But Neil was like, I don't like the name Dr. No. Malik gave me that name. I don't like it. I don't want it. He's like, I want to be called Boy C. And I was like, okay, cool. We'll put Boy C on the flyer. Well, when the time came to get the flyer done the next day, it was like, whoever made the flyer just said, oh, it's Dr. No. And I was sleeping or something, and I forgot to call the guy, and it was already printed. So Neil should have been Boy C, but he was Dr. No. But those were and Sean L. from Liverpool, he played all the piano, Happy Piano House. So we had a good balance. I was playing, you know, I was always trying to keep more of the house funk element in the tunes, although they were like banging hardcore at the time. I was sort of trying to mix the way I would at a house warehouse party. And Neil and Malik, they had the sounds coming in from London, which were hot at the time, and white labels, test presses. No one knew what was playing at any given time. They just knew, as Ryan said, like a few beeps, or like they could. I mean, Eugene must have been going crazy. Actually, you weren't even open yet, Eugene. Eugene, pay attention.
He's tweeting about us.
So yeah, the music was so fresh and revolutionary. It was a revolution. I mean, no one knew what any of the music was. You couldn't find it anywhere really, unless you really dug at Carnival or Star Sound or Record Peddler. And HMV had a few pieces, but you know, it was really a young, fresh scene. And then, you know, guys like Alex, you know, started promoting it through Tribe magazine, and obviously the raves got bigger and bigger through Ryan and Wayne's adventures. Sorry, Steve.
Wayne, aka Steve aka Stretch, aka yeah. Just to kind of follow that through, again, just to move between you guys, and just quickly touch on some of the early producers / promoters who came on the scene, who started throwing big events. Let's start with LifeForce and what your broad focus was, because you guys did a lot under various banners.
Well, the whole concept behind LifeForce was we brought together at the time was Dose, which was myself, my brother, and Aaron, and a little known fact, Chris Burkowski at the time was a part of us. Cyrus and Renegades, which was Rob at the time, and Tyler from Renegades, and Better Days joined us originally in the beginning. And Better Days, unfortunately, decided to take a bow out after a while and just wanted to move on to other things, which was great for them, but unfortunately for the party people, meant no more Better Days parties. And the whole concept was we were all chasing after certain dates in the city. There's only so many, and we all cooperated in one level or another. But really what it came down to is, like, how do you create another date that's going to work in the city? And we all thought, if we come together, we can buy talent together, we can chase after acts that we want at the time, and we can create a new date and promote a party under LifeForce instead of just making up a new gimmicky name. You know what I mean? It had some meaning behind it. And this was at the time where the Chemical Brothers were first starting to break over and being played on mainstream radio. And it was a tough gig trying to book like acts like that you see in the UK. We're playing huge festivals, and we're all looking through like magazines and everything like, why aren't these guys playing shows here? It's because they started to come over to North America through the concert promoter side of things. And what ended up happening is we had to actually try and book the talent through the local concert production companies at the time. I can't remember who it was. It was Clear Channel, or it's constantly evolving or changing, however you want to describe it. So we ended up doing the Chemical Brothers show at the Warehouse in Toronto, sold out in 12 minutes, 2,000 people. And this is a scene where we were doing shows for like 3,000 people, 4,000 people at the time. And it took a good month of sales to sell that many. This thing sold out in like 12 minutes. And that's when we started to see that there was a need for like the full organization and the talent buying. So all of a sudden you have like 4 companies come together, their resources financially as well, and you can build a relationship, you know. And that's why we started, we saw the need to mature, because there were no rules at that time. We were just like kind of flying by the seat of Ryan, like Mark, no one said to Mark, hey, this is how you do it, right? The first week there's gonna be this amount of people, the next week expect this amount. We're just kind of like flying by the seat of our pants. And then sometimes you get caught with your pants down, you know, you get a huge turnout for an event, and you don't have enough sound, you don't have enough water, or, you know what I mean, you can overcompensate, you've blown the bank, and not enough people show up. There was no formula, right?
So LifeForce became a very, very integral crew of people throwing parties that grew to 5,000, 10,000 people, and constantly.
We jumped from like, in 1 year, we jumped from the largest party being 4,000 people. I think it was one of Ryan's events. And then we did this one event called Freakin', where we teamed up Dose and Cyrus, and we brought a hip hop element. And there was a reason, because our relationship we had with our friends in Denver, Brad Roulier and Jason, who ended up forming Beatport. They were partners of ours that we did shows with in Denver. And they were bringing that element into their shows. And that's where Run DMC, De La Soul, and all those guys came in. Because we loved them. Like, we loved like the old funk, the hard beats. And it brought joy to us. It wasn't gangster, you know what I mean? So we would all celebrate together. And that's why we brought that element in. And all of a sudden, like, you know, from one show from 4,000 people, we're dealing with 12,000 people. It was like, finally we were doing like those world dance videos. We were like, holy shit, we can do that production now. We have lasers, 2 stages that are full. And that's when things kind of just, in Toronto, that's how it happened. It was just a switch.
Constant learning curve. Growth for all the way around. I'm curious to actually hear you, Ryan, too, talk a little bit about the growth of Destiny and how you guys got to the point of throwing WEMF and growing WEMF and rethinking WEMF and so on.
So WEMF came around in our 2nd year of existence as our anniversary show. I won't start there, but I do have an interesting story about it, because the very first one is kind of what made WEMF for a very long time. But, you know, when we very first started in 1991, we were throwing parties called Mayhem. You know, the usual, you know, warehouse kind of thing. I think, I can't even remember who played at those parties, but it's so long ago. But that's sort of where I got my feet wet, learned how to lose money, learned how to make sure people didn't die in a warehouse, all those kind of good things you have to do as a promoter. Generally, and I think these guys will probably agree, you know, it takes 1 or 2, maybe even 3 or 4 to really understand what the hell you're doing out there. And you're almost guaranteed that you're going to lose your shirt a couple of times. And every single time for the last 20 years, a young promoter comes up to me who may be like moving bottle service tables at a club, or, you know, selling tickets for an existing night, or being a promoter for something. They're always like, what's the #1 advice you can give me? I'm like, prepare to lose everything you put into it. Because that is the guaranteed thing that happens every single time. The odd one comes around where maybe you just get lucky and you book the right act at the right time, that kind of thing. But 99.9% of the time, whenever you throw anything, you lose your shirt the very first time. And it's really a great learning experience, because it humbles you. Because generally when you go into this game, you go into it because you got a bit of an ego, you think you know everything, you think you understand the music better than anybody else, your friends look up to you to what you should be doing and where you're sending them at night, and you go and you do it, and all of a sudden you fall flat on your face, you're like, wow, I guess I'm not all that. And if you don't have that proper humbling experience, I don't think you become a very good promoter in the long run. So, you know, that's sort of the beginnings of being a promoter. But beyond that, I mean, obviously things change, it becomes a business. We moved into throwing Destiny parties in 1993, same somewhat as LifeForce, but not quite as big. We brought together 4 different companies to become one. And then 2 years into our existence, we decided, hey, we're watching these ads coming out of the UK. We're seeing, articles in Mix Mag and music and all these kind of things about these 3-day festivals, May Day, things along those lines. And like, Canada does not have anything like this, like not even remotely close. I mean, there's raves in a warehouse or there's crappy nightclubs playing top 40. And that was really the only two options you had. Raves in a nightclub. Well, that was actually not even around that. The raves weren't quite there yet, unless it was 3 a.m. and RPM was closed, and then we got to go inside at 3 a.m. and throw our rave. But so we would keep seeing these ads, and May Day was the one that I saw that it was the coolest thing. Artists that I like were playing at it. It was like a 3-day event somewhere in England. I couldn't even tell you where. And I'm like, Canada needs this. So we searched all across Ontario for a place to do this 2-year anniversary party for Destiny. It's going to be a 3-day rave. It's going to be the most amazing thing ever. 100,000 people are going to show up. It's going to be great. So we find Mosport. Great spot. I mean, it's not that far. It's only an hour drive, and anybody who's ever been to WAF knows an hour is pretty easy. And half-hour drive on the flyer.
Tornado country.
So we set up this great festival, 3 stages. We partner with a UK company to bring all the talent over. Everything's going great. I literally had to put every cent I owned on a bond with the city because they demanded to have a $30,000 protection against damage to the roads or road signs in the area. So yeah, it was an interesting thing. And the very first night it's going great. We have about 3,000 people there. Tornado hits. Literally a tornado hits. The tents are destroyed. There's ravers flying through the air. Security is grabbing them, throwing them to the ground. It was chaos. The sun comes up maybe 2 hours later. Everything is destroyed. There's IntelliBeams smashed into the ground. The sound is in mud. There's people, for whatever reason, have decided to all get in their cars and drive around the track. I have no idea why to this day, but that's what they were doing. And I remember the tent guy showed up and the sound guy showed up. And the tent guy was crying because all of his tents were destroyed. Yeah, John. Tent guy was literally crying. And the sound guy shows up and he's like, we got to pack all this up. We got to get it home. We got to get it out of here right now. And I remember I walked up to him and I was like, if we don't open those doors tonight, I'm not paying you. He's like, let's get this stuff set up right now. So because of that weird situation, I almost equate it to like the first time the Beatles came to Toronto. Like, everybody says they were there, but very few people actually were.
That old.
Very few people were actually there. So what happened was all day long on the Saturday, the radio stations, I think it was 108 or whatever was the dance station at the time, it just pounded. Tornado hit this rave, they set it up, it's amazing, you got to go to the tornado rave, go to the tornado rave, go to the tornado rave. And literally like convoys of people start showing up. And had it not been for that sort of thing that locks into people's brains as being something completely unique, I don't know that Wentworth and Destiny would have had sort of that upward spiral that we had after that. But it was one of those sort of life-changing, left turns that happen that you think your life is over, and all of a sudden it gets way better. We still lost all our money, but the party was really good, and the next year we made lots. So that was sort of the beginning of my experience in the scene from a big party perspective.
And then it was WEMF, again, the World Electronic Music Festival, continued to grow and grow and grow. You took a rethink for a while and grew it again and continued to produce loads of events. I'd like to ask you, Alex, I think back to, in a minute we'll talk a little bit about how people promoted back in the day before there was a whole lot of Facebook, Twitter, etc. But Tribe was key, very, very key. It was like, basically you either went to the parties and stood outside and collected a whole lot of flyers, or you looked in community stores, or you definitely looked on the Tribe message boards. And before I ask you about, kind of promotion and so on, are there other promoters or key DJs you'd like to give shout outs to as kind of being in the earlier end of the rave and scene and helping us build it in the city?
I think what these guys are talking about here, these are only a couple of the promoters, the rave companies that were around at the time. There were a whole bunch. There was actually like a dozen or so companies. Yeah, fighting for the key Saturday night, and the beauty of it is that they were really, really competitive, and I know from talking to each of them, they seem really nice now, but at the time, they were very, very competitive, and rightly so. When you put all your money on the line and you put all your effort on the line for something to work out, and someone else throws a party on the same night, you'd be really upset. But anyway, the companies started separating into playing different genres of music. There was like a jungle rave company, and a happy hardcore rave company, and a more housey flavored rave company, and a bigger one and a smaller one, and all the cracks started getting filled in with these different companies. But the shout outs I'd really like to give are to the people, to the ravers who actually were the people who came out and to party, the ones who climbed out of their houses, out of their bedrooms, and down the tree to get away from the parents so that they could stay out all night and party till like the next morning, and the ones who made their own clothes, to their own outfits to go out and, you know, they brought something with them. Whenever they came to an event, they brought something. They didn't go just to take something away. They came to bring something to it, and that's something I don't see happening now, but that was really important. And as a result of all that, like, clothing companies started sprouting up, and to support the rave scene, you know, made in Canada clothing, clothes that people could dance in that wouldn't break, like, you know, triple stitching on the seams, and like industrial strength clothing, and graphic designers sprouted up to support the flyers that these guys here were you know, producing. And it was a whole community and a whole industry, and Tribe I was almost at the center of it all, and people were connecting through Tribe. There wasn't any Facebook, there wasn't any cell phones, smartphones. There weren't smartphones at the time, and yeah, it's cell phones, yeah, but not like not Facebook or social networking or anything. So people were connecting through the magazine itself, and through each other by, you know, in face-to-face contact, right?
I was thinking about whether there were cell phone pockets, and I brought my very first snug record bag. I have a few at home from various points in time. The first one has no pockets for cell phones. I'll just point that out.
Yeah.
I would also add, it wasn't just the fact that we had sort of big, bulky cell phones at the time, but as a promoter, and I'm sure Steve was the same, 2 pagers and a cell phone, because we didn't want to waste a lot of minutes on your cell phone, so you'd wait, see if the person was worth calling back, and then...
That's your excuse and you're sticking to it, right?
All right, so when we think back, I almost wore a pair of Fiction 416 pants today, bright orange, big ones, but I don't think they'd fit anyway back in the day. But, you know, when you think back to some of the key players that way, I mean, we had Snug, we had Fiction, Geek Boutique, many designers, lots and lots and lots of community stuff representing. And really, I think one of the big differences then, as Alex was just touching on, is the fact that all of these businesses, firstly, it felt almost like a revolution that people could create these independent businesses, do what they want to do, be connected to a scene, and help that scene actually thrive. Everything kind of fed into each other for a beautiful period of time. Would you guys like to touch on that at all with the shops?
The shops were really necessary for the scene as well, because to buy your ticket for the rave, you had to go into a shop. You couldn't buy them online. There was no internet. So you'd have to go to Play the Record or a record shop, or the main shop was Ecstatic that was down by Much Music, and that was something alley, Graffiti Alley, and that was the hub. I mean, that's where you went through the week to get your clothing, your tickets, and Alan mixtapes too, which we never got paid for, but who cares? It was good promotion.
Neither did the artists, so there you go.
We actually made more money, I think, on most parties on the mixtapes of the recordings from the party than we actually ever made on the party. So.
Serious?
That shows you how popular they were. You would literally probably make, or probably produce, you know, upwards of, you know, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 tapes from a party.
So,
even upwards.
So you
of
owe me a bit of money then.
I don't think.
You can also tell who people were by when you walk down Queen Street, and you wouldn't hear like the same kind of noise you'd hear coming out of cars. If all of a sudden you heard like a drum bass track or a house track, you'd look over, where's oh, that guy there, and you look at him and go, I seen that fucking guy. And you'd be like, hey man, what's up? And you keep walking around. But now there was no commercial side to things. It was just like you literally would fight to hear one good tune at a friend's house. Just come on, let me hear it for 10 minutes, I swear. You can have it back. Pearl Jam's in. Dude, it's my left hand. Pearl Jam's here. My tape's here. And that's kind of how things move forward, and we were able to promote. Like, we've got Mark Oliver coming up, the best. He's got the hottest mixtape right now, and it helped you get gigs as well. Not that you needed help, but the demand would increase most definitely. That's all I have.
You know, Plady has been mentioned, and of course, Plady has a booth right behind us here, and they're here all weekend, and they've got lots of good
Eugene,
stuff. So
yay.
little plug. I also think about shops like Eastern Bloc. They were, of course, heavy on the D&B and breaks, all that sort of stuff. You know, people got to specialize, and there was that kind of sense of community, even as the scene grew. And I'd like to touch on a little bit, you know, there's pluses and minuses to this, but how is it that the scene grew so quickly from being in dodgy warehouses to being in venues at the C&E Cool House before 3 a.m., and of course getting to the stage where you had to hire tons and tons of after-hour cops and so on, or off-duty cops and so on. So let's talk a little bit about the movement from tiny spaces to the larger clubs, the C&E, et cetera, and what kind of production elements had to go into those venues.
I think just to explain scenes a bit, like if you're looking at scenes like disco or new wave or back in the old days, scenes have a growth. As soon as they catch fire, they start getting more and more popular, and they reach a peak, and then they go over the hill and they go down, and scenes dissolve after they've hit this peak. And it happens with any scene, and this is what happened with the rave scene. It became more and more popular, and people who ended up going were not necessarily going for, I would say, the right reasons, but the reasons the initial ravers
mixed
went
elements,
for,
for
the music or whatever. They weren't going for that. They
It
were
kind of eats itself after a bit, really. You have
Yeah.
people showing up not just for the music or for the experience, but they start showing up for habitual reasons, to be politically somewhat correct.
And then those people, I mean, the more and more people, you need the control, and it started becoming visible to the city and the police, and whereas before it wasn't. I mean, there was actually a rave in the CN Tower.
Yeah.
That people didn't know what a rave was. I'm sure if had they known, the promoter that threw it would never have got permission to do it. But
Ontario Place, Science Center.
Yeah, the Science Center.
We actually did one not far from here on King in an underground parking garage. We used 3 levels right by King and Spadina, and they couldn't do anything about it.
At the Island Airport.
Yeah, Island Airport.
And Sasha played at the CN Tower one night. 14 people were there because they were checking ID at the bottom of the CN Tower, and they wouldn't. Half the crowd were 18, so they couldn't get up.
So yeah, the scene grew to
Yeah,
this
the scene
massive.
to the point where.
We started dealing with, we used to do events like for a reasonable amount of money. Like if you're borrowing money or using your own money, however way you want to put it, you got to come up with $30,000, $40,000 to do an event. It's a lot of money, like especially nowadays. But all of a sudden, once you start dealing with the larger quantities of people, as Ryan can attest from his experience to where he is presently, you're dealing with a budget that goes from $30,000, and you have 4,000, 5,000 people to 12 to 15,000 people. Your budget quadruples, and even more to all of a sudden you're looking at $180,000, and your pay duties are in the numbers of 80 to 90, and your security is in 60, 70 when you used to have 20, 30. You knew them all by name. You know what I mean? And now you've just got 2 trailers of people that you don't even know, that you're paying gobs of money to control the people that you invited to come out to party. Mind you, they're protecting them and aiding them throughout the night, but it's quite a sum of money for anyone to get involved in, especially when you have to bring in the elements of insurance, etc.
It's funny to hear you say that $180,000 is a lot to throw a party, when I think my security budget last week was $180,000 for digital dreams. So no, it's insane how expensive it can get, and I think it's a good segue, to answer your question. And the scene grew because more people wanted to be involved in it, more people wanted to hear the music, and I don't necessarily have the same opinion as Alex does, in the sense that people may be coming for the wrong reason or anything like that. When we started doing what we started doing it because we wanted to introduce the music that we loved and the events that we loved to as many people as possible. We looked around and said, the club scene sucks, there's nothing to do, and this is so amazing. I would just wish everybody would like this, and everybody would like this music, and everybody would come out. And that's what we worked very hard to create. So our goal was always to make it as big as possible, and to get as many people out, and to keep growing and going into larger venues and doing all those things, because we felt that the more people we could convince to join this scene, the better the world would be. And I don't say that in a hippy-dippy, bark nibbling kind of way. I say it in the sense that if you go to our events, regardless of what may happen on the fringes or being part of it, for the most part, these events are filled with very good people, and the people that join them from other scenes become better people. And that's what we always saw, and that's what we always felt would be better for society in general. So we wanted to be more and more and more to happen. So it wasn't necessarily about chasing the dollar at all times. Obviously, it's our job. It was our career. It was something we chose to do. So you have to make a living doing it, and everybody wants a raise. But at the end of the day, if your heart is not in it, this is absolutely the wrong career to go into, because, it's probably the hardest way to make money of almost anything other than maybe getting punched in the face in MMA or something. But, it totally, for me, has always been about introducing as many people as possible to the scene. And in my job and in my career now, we go and we do events now for 60,000 people. I still think there's a lot more people out there that should be coming out to our events and experiencing the scene and experiencing the music.
I'm curious, as we're talking about the growth, the question I asked and so on, I want to also just kind of give context. I mentioned off the top that Toronto's rave scene at points was arguably the biggest in North America for a number of years. And maybe starting with you, Mark, just to touch on how Toronto was seen, not just by the international DJs who were all being brought into town, because back in the day it was primarily the internationals who were getting the shine, but just what's your sense of how Toronto was seen globally as you traveled, as you talked to friends and so on? How was Toronto's rave movement regarded?
Well, I think we had a strong foundation to begin with, even before the rave scene came about. Twilight Zone was one of the first 3 house clubs in the world. So you had Paradise Garage in Chicago, Paradise Garage in New York, the Warehouse in Chicago, and Twilight Zone here. And people would come up every weekend from New York to experience Twilight Zone. You'd have David Morales, Frankie Knuckles playing there, and they had a killer sound system. And that's basically what the rave scene came out of, was the house music scene. It was very small here, but it was definitely a great scene. And then, when it exploded in the UK, North America tried to emulate the European vibe or the UK sound. So we've always had that history. I don't think we've always exposed it, a lot of times it was like, okay, bring this guy or this DJ over from, Japan or from Europe, because they're hot over there. But at the meantime, we had probably the strongest scene in North America even before the rave scene started, because, we had looser laws controlling the clubs to begin with. And so anyway, I think, when DJs come here, they feel safe. They've got a great club. They've got people knowing what's going on sound and light-wise. And they're surprised, because we don't really get on the blowhorn and say, hey, come here. We don't promote really outside of Toronto, and we're always bringing people in.
We're Canadian. We don't talk about it too much.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. But you know what? That's what the great thing about it is, because the whole scene was based on everyone being equal, peace, love, and unity, along with the music, and it was always about the music. So there was really no way it could fail. It was just a matter of time before it caught on. It caught on quicker in the UK because a lot of the youth were unemployed, and there was a lot of anti-Thatcherism. I won't get into the whole political side, but there was a lot of unrest, and this was an escape for youth in Britain to get together and band together, and it was a tribe. People came together, and it happened here, but just not in the same way and not as quickly, but it definitely happened. And people can come from Europe, DJs can come here and say, hey, this is just like at home, but better weather.
Well, I think one of the things...
what made our excuse me for a second, I think what made the growth really strong, and the reason why you can still throw these huge things, is that the growth was organic. It started at its own pace here, and everyone who was doing it, from the retail store to the DJs to the promoters, they weren't doing it to throw these huge parties immediately. They were growing it slowly and slowly and slowly, and it took 10 years. I published Tribe for 10 years, and that growth happened over that period, and I think that's what still made us strong, right?
We had to educate them, and we're all a part of that, right?
Yeah, slowly. It's just suddenly you don't have events with hundreds of thousands of people. It takes a lot to grow that, right? That's I think why we're
Just
so
that point of education, to follow on something you said earlier as well, and Steve, immediately when I said arguably the largest scene in North America, you said absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I heard all the time from international people, and I'd love your perspective on this, especially thinking about Toronto talent and so on, is the fact that I always heard two things. One is that people who came from overseas were shocked at just how open and knowledgeable the crowds were about music, and also people were blown away by the skills of the DJs who live here.
Locally, I think Toronto, it's starting to show now. Globally, I think we have dozens of TO talent jumping the pond, traveling, headlining the festivals like throughout the Europe as well as in the States. And like we're not as shy or hidden. Like Mark's known globally. It's not like a little known fact. It's actually quite open known. And Mark is, through several interviews I've read, he's chosen to stay home. Otherwise, we'd never see him. We'd probably forget what he looks like unless we read magazines constantly. However, Toronto's got so much talent traveling globally, and it's all because of the education that's happened. Like a scene bubbled up, it happened, and it's rebirthed again, and it's all about the education. And there's that commercial sound that's always going to be around, and that when we spoke of, like when we all first started out DJing, as well as throwing parties and being involved in the music scene, when you say, like, you know, I'm into electronic music or I'm into house or whatever, the first thing they think of is Aqua. You know what I mean? What was that song? I'm a Barbie girl or whatever. Like that was what people thought of when they thought of dance music. So that's what they were looking at you. They're like, okay, buddy, well, whatever. And they didn't understand, like, you know, how intelligent, the depth, how the emotion involved with the music, let alone what could happen if you went out one night and just put the trust in the evening and came out the other side. You were not the same person. And it's not like one person did that change or just the DJ, but it was everybody collectively. And one of the things we used to put on our flyer all the time and preach to people was, if like-minded people, we're just looking for like-minded people to come out to our events, share an experience, and keep in contact afterwards. It's not a matter of just going, grabbing people and putting bodies in venues. It had to have some meaning because it meant something to us as each one of these people up here. And I think that's what we're trying to express in one form or another, without coming across too douchebaggy.
Well, I think we should mention too, Kenny Glasgow Art Department is one of the biggest acts globally right now. And their manager, Terrence Lung, he designed all the, he designed all the flyers
great graphic
for all the
designer.
raves. Every Exodus flyer he designed.
all the industry flyers.
Yeah, pleasure for, I mean, the people that were in it from the start, that were in it for the right reasons. I mean, back then, people were like, oh, he's just trying to make money. We weren't making money. We were in it because we loved the music, and we were all about spreading the message and the word and coming together as a family. Yeah, there was a lot of competition, but the main route was to be peaceful and loving to each other, and that was expressed through the music, through all the house music originally. So all the people that were in the scene and helping it grow were in it for all those reasons, and they're still here today. I mean, just look around. This is 22 years on since Exodus, and we're all still here.
And still active. And in fact, again, the legacy panel comes up at 6 o'clock, and we'll touch on a lot of what's happening now that directly ties to, not just in terms of people, but in terms of music and scenes and so on. But to make sure we have a little bit of time for questions, I wanted to, we kind of established that the rave movement started really building in earnest in Toronto in the very early 90s. And, you know, we could, you know, debate when the end was or when the transition was. We can look at the movement into clubs like Industry and System Soundbar and Turbo and so on, that whole thing. But one thing I want to mention specifically and ask you, Alex, to talk about is iDance in 2000 and why that was necessary, and did that really begin to signal the beginning of the end?
I think there was so much pressure put on the promoters, and so the landlords were starting to tighten up on the spaces to rent for events. The city, the police were starting to crack down. There was all this media about
Zeal?
people dying at raves, and statistically, you know, like it's a hard point to argue that when 200,000 people, one death out of 200,000 is not a lot. More people get struck by lightning than die at raves or whatever. These kind of things don't make any sense when the front page of the newspaper says a person dies in rave, and it could have been in France or something, or in England. But the police see this and they began to crack down. So eventually it came to the point where there was some noise at Toronto City Hall about them banning raves, and so we put together a protest called I Dance with a bunch of core people in the scene and with lots of support from the rave community to show how raves could be not about death and about life and about music and about positive energy, and so we threw a huge party at Toronto City Hall to show them, and eventually they backed away from that, but in a sense that was I think that the key moment when people started to realize that it had gone over that peak, right, and it was starting to go down the other side of the parabola there, and we threw another eye dance, that second one. Actually, the second one is there.
That's the second one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Alex, I just want to jump in. Alex said we threw a huge party down at City Hall. I mean, it was the largest protest in the history of Toronto.
Yeah, it was a huge,
the largest,
huge
and
crowd.
to this day, it's still the largest protest in the history of Toronto. If I'm not mistaken, we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 people down at Nathan Phillips Square at Queen. They had to close Queen, they had to close Bay, and it was a pretty good party.
And a lot
And we
of
changed the law that, and we actually changed the law that day.
Well, yeah, support from some key councillors, and the late Jack Layton was a huge supporter of the movement, the rave movement, and Olivia Chow today is even.
He was a
strong
great
supporter.
DJ too.
Yeah, a good guy he was, and yeah, but yeah, I think that signaled the sort of the peak and the downfall after that.
Unfortunately, as soon as there was a death related to the scene, that's when I think everybody realized we're on our own here. We don't have a PR firm that's representing all of us and going out. Whatever gets printed in the paper is taken as the word, right? And it just so happens there was that one death that took place that was as a result of that. That took place on a Saturday night, and on the Monday, as LifeForce, we were going into Sky Dome to sign the papers to finalize an event we were supposed to do there for Halloween. We ended up losing the space and ended up doing a party, as if you guys were around, you remember, outside at the docks. We had a good 18,000 people, shut down Cherry Street and everything. It was related to the fact that no one took anything that we had to say beyond just being gossip, really. It was kind of weird. No matter how many ties, suits, and lawyers you had with you, they just didn't want to hear it.
Yeah, and it took probably another almost 15 years to get Sky Dome, now Rogers Centre, to agree to do events like this. When we did Dead Mouse there a couple of years ago, it was the first time they had ever done an electronic event. Obviously, we've done a couple more since, but there was so much work that went into convincing people. It was 15 years had gone by and there had been no issue, but yet there was just no chance in hell that they were ever going to do this, and months of discussion from the largest concert company in the world could not convince them until we sat down over many months. And now they love it. Now they think it's great. They make way more money on it than they do at an Argos game. So they're happy to have us. But that one newspaper headline literally removed the ability to do safe professional events from the promoters' repertoire in Toronto for a very long time.
The thing is, the promoters were really willing to work with the police too. I remember being in meetings, and the police would come in, and the promoters were willing to do anything the police said, basically, to get to make sure the events were safe and to comply with whatever the police said. But that even wasn't enough for a retired
police officer to come in and consult on special events.
Yeah, that was Alex D, right?
One of.
So we could obviously devote an easy 2 hours to this topic because there's many strands of thought to follow on this one, and we do need to wrap up, and I would like some time to take a few questions. So I think actually what Ryan just touched on points to the fact that there would be a very different answer to my final question to you all probably 5 years ago than there would be today, which is very quickly, from Alex down, did the rave scene in Toronto ever really end, or did it just morph, transition, and become something beautiful today?
I'm going to be the guy that says the different thing on this panel. I'm going to say that it's not here anymore. What we have now is something entirely new. the promoters back in the day were always looking for corporate sponsorship to throw their events, and they could never get it. They tried and tried, and I think Ryan got a beer company once to sponsor WEMF, and I know how hard you, Coors Light, right? How hard you tried for that, and in a way, I'm glad there was no corporate sponsorship back then, because it made the events more underground and more real, and it separated that from the Lady Gagas of the world, right? The raves were underground, and that's what made them special to so many people. But now this is all, I was going to ask you, like, how much of this getting the Sky Dome was because Rogers is supporting it, like, or whoever the main sponsor is, like, because Rogers is involved, does it make drug use any better? Than if they weren't involved, to me, it doesn't make any sense, But anyway,
Three letters, EDM.
Yeah. I think it's commercial. It's the new commercial, but there is still underground stuff going on, and the next panel will be talking about that. And there are some underground clubs in Toronto, if you're visiting Toronto, to check out. Footwork is one of them. And underground promoters that still throw events that are below the level of corporate sponsorship, and all about music and vibe and that kind of stuff. So it still exists today, but it is what we see now in these huge events that you throw. I'm not I know how hard you work to do it, but it's definitely not raves, right? It's not. And you've done both too. So.
Yeah, no, I think I would actually agree with you that the rave scene as we knew it and as we created back in the 90s is no longer with us. I don't necessarily know that I think that's a good or a bad thing. I'm still a little bit indifferent on that. I mean, we did a lot of things that weren't very safe. We did a lot of things that you had to do, or we just did because we were young and inexperienced, and no one was there to help us or guide us or do any of those things. I mean, we were in some pretty sketchy locations that were pretty dangerous for people, and yeah, it gave it that cool underground feel. But someone could have easily fallen down the well or into the pit of white goo that did exist. So I mean, yes, the cool underground, dirty rave scene that we created and did and worked in for many years. No, it doesn't exist. But for the most part, even back in the '90s, most of them weren't like that. I mean, Steve and I were doing parties at the CNE, at the Better Living Center, and the Automotive Building. We were doing shows in rented warehouses and rented party centers. So that sort of image of this very cool underground scene, for the most part, was done in very professional locations with paid duty officers and security and all these kind of things. So, I don't necessarily have a problem with the sort of that sort of dangerous underground sort of being gone, where 3,000 kids are in a fire trap with one door.
Just want to point out, Matt C has entered the tent.
But at the end of the day, everything moves on, everything progresses. And I think the one key to remember is whether or not electronic music has become the mainstream or the new pop or any of those kind of terms you want to give to it, that doesn't necessarily mean there's no more underground. There's now a commercial side of the music and of the scene that has to be supported. And there are people out there that are happy to support it, and that's what they like doing on a Friday night. But that doesn't mean that stops there being an underground. What happens, hopefully, is people come into this very commercial pop scene at the top because it's their introduction to a music that they find entertaining, and then that challenges them to then learn more about the scene and learn more about the music, and then hopefully they're listening to Art Department or Jamie Jones or somebody else on the underground scene a year after that. But if you don't have that easy gateway, it makes it a lot harder to get to the underground.
Yeah, it's true. People are probably listening to very different music at school now, Steve. Mark, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with what Ryan and Alex have mentioned. I think that what we need to do is define what a rave is before we answer that question. And we all agree, I think, that the raves were originally based on a family, peace, love, unity, respect, and along with the music. So that vibe has definitely, I wouldn't say it is gone, but it pops up here and there, but not every week the way it used to be. I think festival like Harvest Festival, Promise, parties down at Cherry Beach, you'll find that's a rave in my eyes. You may not have glow sticks and all the whistles anymore, but it's the same people. They're in there for all the same reasons, and it might be going in the afternoon instead of at 4 in the morning. but they're all there for the same reasons. I think what kind of makes things confusing is, you know, when I play a festival, say like Veld, and it looks like fashion-wise, like all the 18, 19-year-old kids are like wearing all the 80s day glow and waving the glow sticks. It looks like a
Beautiful.
rave, and the music is just like a rave, but I think the underlying theme is missing what it was all based on to begin with, in my eyes.
I
Steve?
think it kind of reminds you of talking to your parents about something. They're like, I remember when. You don't know shit. I think what's happened is it exists. It's there because it's just evolved. You know what I mean? And some of us have evolved with us. Some of us haven't. You know what I mean? The scene's there. It's bubbling. New talent's coming through Toronto. And that's where, like, let's be honest here. How many times have you looked at a flyer or a foreign event and looked at a lineup and seen a Canadian flag by a DJ and you're like, who the fuck is that? They came from Toronto and they started out in Toronto, used to do shows at the supermarket. Throughout, the scene's always been there. It's just not in our eyes what it should have been. And we kind of molded our scene, you know what I mean? So something's coming up underneath us from behind us and it started picking things up. Like Joel and the Footwork crew, they're continually banging it out every week. Not every week I want to go, but they're full every week. There's something going on. You know what I mean? So that we give respect back to the people. And it's true, like Ryan was saying, the entry level. And at a point in Toronto, trance was extremely popular. And it was actually seen as the gateway music because it told you what to do. You stood there, drum roll, hands in the air, crescendo. You're like, okay, it's an instruction manual built right in. You know what I mean? And afterwards, that was not my thing. Like Ryan, you got to remember, back in the day, Ryan used to have palm trees on the back of his flyers with an X through it, or sorry, just a slash. I'm like, what the fuck is this? Oh, dude, no jungle. 3 years after we stopped doing events, I'm like, you want to go see Ed Rush and Optical? Sure, who's playing? Oh, they're playing at a Destiny party. What the fuck? Destiny?
All right. I think you've answered the question, Steve.
Sorry about my language.
Thank you, you guys. Now, I think we have about 2 minutes for questions. And again, we're picking up on this very, very theme in the panel from 6 to 7 that Joel from Footwork and many other great folks are a part of as well. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. First hand in the air. Is your hand in the air or are you just stretching? Yeah, yes.
Hi there, my name is Frankie, and I'm a raver from back in the 90s. I survived that crazy, wonderful period. And my question is, what sort of long-term viability do you see Toronto's underground rave scene having with the loss of spaces at clubs on Richmond Street, and apparently the Guvernment is going to be going soon, and the Waverley Hotel, there's something going on with that, and the comfort zone will be gone when that hotel is destroyed. So
Yeah.
what do you see in terms of the long-term future?
You're saying what the loss of spaces, what kind of effect that has had on you can see what's happened with the club district. We had a club district. At one
Yes.
point, it's no longer
Yes,
there. It's
that's what I
condo
meant.
showrooms and now going to be condominiums or whatever. Gentrification is wiping it out, and it's happened in other cities in the world too. But I think you need spaces in a downtown core of a city, of an urban city, of a big city like Toronto, in order to have a scene, right? You need that. You can't push it out to the suburbs. It just doesn't work, right?
I think the same thing will happen that's happened now, is it'll just morph and it adapts. Like before, when, as back in the day, we were doing our warehouse parties, we'd end at 10 a.m. And if we ended at 9 a.m., oh, you didn't want to be around for that. Turn on the lights at 9. What are you doing? You jacked me for an hour. We had to move into the proper venues like the CNE and the International Center, and then we had to close at 7. So we had to start putting times on the flyers and let everybody know. Set times got crushed back, so the sketch got cut back, and people started finding their way home. The whole idea of throwing a party during the day, like Ryan's doing right now, was a dream for us because it would open up so many avenues, so many venues. And that's kind of where we're at right now. That nighttime is kind of gone, or has it? You know what I mean? If it hasn't, there's a lot of places where you don't even want to talk about it. Let's just keep it where it's at, right? But the daytime venues, you can do an event during the day and get 50,000 people out. Whereas before, if we were shutting parties down at 6 a.m., it was a riot. So, I think everything's kind of evolved and it's taken its own life, but at the same time, could it go back to the late night again in retaliation? You know what I mean? Some of the acts coming out now, they all have nighttime names.
And we'll definitely be picking up on, to answer your question, the next panel will address that a lot because it has been a lot about movement into different types of venues. We are getting the wrap up. Andrew had his hand up too. Mark, would you mind passing the microphone to Andrew back
Okay,
there?
I wanted to pull a Jerry Springer first, though.
And we'll take one more question and then we'll move ourselves along.
Hey, I don't know if this is a bit of a distraction from the evolving aspect of the rave scene, but I noticed, like, I'd gone to events in like 93, 94, and I noticed there's a transition from having a diversity of genres of electronic dance music within events, because I could hear everything from trip hop to Rotterdam, and jungle and trance and house, everything in between. And it was nice because I would get a sampling of music on a large system with lots of people who were into that I may not have listened to it otherwise. Like, I was involved with Holly Ballou, and I didn't really like happy hardcore, but it was different when you'd have 1,000 people all into it. So what do you guys think about that kind of, that segue between having a variety of electronic music to having unigenre parties that were just all jungle, all trance, or all house, or whatnot?
It's interesting to bring that up because we have that debate quite often because doing WAMF, we have a variety of stuff going on and we're always booking 7 different genres to sort of appeal to as a wider range of people as possible, and doing the festivals now the same thing. But when we do our one-off events at Cool House or the Government or Sound Academy, the debate always comes back to you can't change the vibe. You got to keep if it's dubstep or drum and bass or house or whatever, it's got to be that room and it's got to stay that way all day or people get pissed off. Well, I don't think they do. I mean, for many, many years, all the Destiny parties would be, you start with some heavy hardcore, then you go into some trance, and then you end it with some house, and then you have some jungle and some breakbeat stuff going on in the other room. And I think people, they're not cemented to the floor. There's nobody's coming in there and nailed their shoes to the floor. They can actually walk around, and they're able to move from room to room.
That made it excellent. People would discover
that's what I
new
really
music.
enjoyed.
They would discover new music by accidentally walking into the wrong room, and they'd hear this and they go, "Oh my God, this is excellent."
And I think where a lot of this comes from is it comes from club promoters throwing parties. So when you have a nightclub, you generally have a nightclub and you cater to a certain clientele and you make sure the music caters to that clientele. So when you have a club promoter who then becomes an event promoter, they don't have that vision of, hey, let's change the music up completely every hour and a half. And I can tell you right now that there is always a debate about exactly what you asked. It's not gone. It just, it depends where you're going to the event. Is it a festival or a party, or is it just more of a club night? Because you're going to find the variety in those first two and not the latter.
And it also ties very much to the earlier question about venues and being able to access spaces with 2 rooms or more. Yeah, it's often a very simple question about what's available out there, and there are less and less options. So thank you, everybody, for being here and paying so much attention when there's so much going on at this fantastic festival. And please give a round of applause to these guys, our fantastic panelists.
Oh, hold on. And thank Denise here.
Yes, thank you to Denise.
Whose show on CKLN in the 90s, who was a station manager at CKLN for the longest time, program director, was a great place where you could hear new music and hear about events and DJs and stuff. And you were really instrumental in growing the scene too, I think.
Yeah, Denise.
Thanks, Denise.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. We'll be back here in 30 minutes for the new panel. If you're interested in what to do right now, there is 5 Alarm Funk is doing a chat over in the South Orchard over here. If you saw them on the main stage earlier, they'll be talking about their music. Jessica Stewart Few will be starting on the Red Path stage as well shortly. Thanks for joining us.